67 years old, he stood outside a small house in the Philippines, watching the sun slowly drop behind the mountains. Just 2 years earlier, he had never even been outside the United States. Now, he was living halfway across the world, spending less than he ever had, meeting people he never expected, and living a life he never imagined at his age. But getting here wasn't easy, because just a few years before, retirement wasn't what he expected at all. The days felt long, the bills kept coming, and the life he had worked over 40 years for didn't feel like freedom. Then one night, he came across something that changed everything. Videos of people starting over living abroad, finding a different kind of life. And one place kept appearing again and again: the Philippines. At first, the idea felt impossible. He was 67 years old. Starting over at that age wasn't supposed to happen. But within a few months, he packed his bags, booked a one-way ticket, and stepped into a life that would change everything. Before the Philippines, his life followed a routine that had slowly built over decades. He had spent most of his adult life working steady jobs, nothing glamorous, but enough to build a stable life. He wasn't wealthy, but he wasn't struggling either. Like many people his age, he worked, saved when he could, and looked forward to retirement as the time when life would finally slow down. For years, retirement felt like a finish line, a point where the long days and early mornings would finally be replaced with freedom. And when he finally reached 67, that moment came. He stopped working. He collected his retirement income, and at first, it felt like everything he had worked toward. But slowly, something began to change. The days felt longer. The routine felt smaller. He found himself doing the same things over and over again. Morning coffee, watching TV, running errands, then back home again. The pace was slower, but not in the way he imagined. It wasn't relaxing. It felt quiet, too quiet. And while retirement removed the stress of work, it introduced something else. Time. More time than he knew what to do with. At the same time, the cost of living didn't slow down. Groceries felt more expensive. Utilities kept rising. Unexpected expenses appeared more often than he expected. He wasn't struggling, but he started thinking more carefully about money. Retirement wasn't stressful, but it wasn't as comfortable as he imagined either. And slowly, a thought began forming. Was this it? Was this what the rest of his life was going to look like? He wasn't unhappy, but he wasn't excited either. And at 67, he realized something. He still wanted more, but he didn't know what that meant yet. Until one night, something caught his attention. It started like it does for many people, just casually scrolling online, watching videos, passing time. Then he came across something that made him stop. A video about someone retiring overseas. At first, he didn't think much of it. But then another video appeared, and another. People talking about moving abroad, living on less, starting over later in life. It wasn't something he had seriously considered before. But the idea was interesting. And then one location kept appearing again and again. The Philippines. Warm weather. Friendly people. Affordable living. A slower pace. It sounded different from everything he was used to. At first, he watched out of curiosity. But the more he watched, the more the idea stayed in his mind. Could he actually do something like this? At 67? It felt unrealistic. He had never traveled far. He had never lived outside the United States. And starting over at his age felt like something most people wouldn't even consider. But the idea kept coming back. And over time, curiosity slowly turned into something else. Possibility. He started researching more. Looking at videos. Reading comments. Watching people share their experiences. Some stories were positive. Others were more cautious. But one thing stood out. People weren't just moving for cheaper living. They were moving for a different kind of life. And that idea stayed with him. Because retirement had given him time. And now, he started wondering if that time could be spent somewhere completely different. And slowly, the idea that once felt impossible started to feel real. The more he looked into the Philippines, the more the idea stopped feeling like something distant and started feeling like something he could actually do. At first, he didn't tell anyone. It felt too early, too uncertain. But the thought kept returning. What if he really did start over? What if retirement didn't have to look the same as everyone else's? And slowly, curiosity turned into planning. He started looking at flights, reading about visas, watching videos about daily life. Even small details began to interest him. What groceries cost, what rent looked like, how people spent their days. The more he looked, the more the idea felt less like a dream and more like a decision waiting to be made. But making that decision wasn't easy. At 67, most people weren't thinking about starting over. They were settling in, staying close to family, keeping life predictable. And part of him wondered if he was being unrealistic. But another part of him kept asking the same question. If not now, when? Because retirement had changed something. For the first time in decades, he had flexibility. He had time. And he realized something that surprised him. He wasn't ready to slow down. He wasn't ready for quiet routines. He still wanted something different. And slowly, he began to accept the idea. He would try it. Not forever. Just long enough to see what it was like. Just long enough to know if the idea matched reality. But once that decision formed, everything started moving quickly. He looked at flights, checked dates, compared prices. And before he fully realized what he was doing, he booked a one-way ticket. It wasn't something he had planned for years. It wasn't something he had carefully mapped out. It was a decision that slowly built, and then suddenly became real. And once that ticket was booked, there was no turning back. Because for the first time in decades, he was about to step into something completely unknown. The weeks before the trip felt different. Excitement mixed with uncertainty. He packed carefully, not knowing exactly what he would need, not knowing how long he would stay. He brought essentials, clothes, important documents, a few personal items. But most of all, he brought curiosity, because this wasn't just a vacation. It was something bigger. The day of the flight, everything started to feel real. Airports, long lines, boarding passes. It had been years since he had taken a trip like this. And now, he was traveling halfway across the world. The flight itself was long, hours passing slowly, watching movies, trying to sleep, thinking about what waited on the other side. And at times, doubt crept in. Was this the right decision? Was he being unrealistic? But then he reminded himself why he was doing this. To try something different. To see what retirement could look like somewhere else. To experience something new, even at 67. And when the plane finally began its descent, he looked out the window. Below him, islands scattered across the water. Green landscapes. Small towns. Something completely different from what he was used to. And when the plane touched down, he realized something. He'd actually done it. At 67 years old, he had just moved halfway across the world. And stepping off the plane, everything felt new. The warm air, the different sounds, the unfamiliar surroundings. It wasn't just a new place. It felt like a new chapter. And within days, things started changing. The first few days were filled with small discoveries. Simple things felt different. The weather was warmer. The pace felt slower. People seemed more relaxed. Even daily errands felt different from what he was used to. At first, everything felt unfamiliar. But slowly, that unfamiliar feeling started turning into something else. Curiosity. He explored nearby streets, visited small shops, watched how people moved through their day. And one of the first things he noticed was how relaxed everything felt. There wasn't the same rush he was used to. People took their time. Conversations lasted longer. Life moved at a different pace. And for someone who had just spent decades working, that slower pace felt refreshing. But it wasn't just the atmosphere. he started noticing something else. The cost of things. Meals that were affordable. Transportation that was inexpensive. Daily expenses that felt lighter than what he was used to. It wasn't about living luxuriously. It was about living comfortably, without constantly thinking about money. And that was something he hadn't expected to feel so quickly. He started building a simple routine. Morning walks. Coffee at small local spots. Exploring nearby areas. Meeting people along the way. And slowly, the unfamiliar environment started feeling comfortable. But what surprised him most wasn't just the affordability. It was how he felt. More relaxed. Less rushed. More present. It wasn't something he had planned. It just happened naturally. And within a few weeks, something became clear. This wasn't just a trip anymore. It was starting to feel like home. But just as things started settling in, something unexpected began to happen. And that's when his life started changing in ways he never imagined. At first, the changes were small. He started sleeping better, waking up earlier without alarms, taking his time in the mornings. There was no rush, no deadlines, no pressure to be anywhere. And slowly, he noticed something else. He wasn't thinking about money as much. Back home, every trip to the store felt like a calculation. Every unexpected expense meant adjusting something else. But here, things felt lighter. Not because he was spending less on everything, but because life itself felt simpler. He didn't need as much. Meals were simple. Transportation was easy. Entertainment didn't revolve around spending. Sometimes, just sitting outside, watching the day pass, felt enough. And that was something he hadn't experienced in years. But the biggest change wasn't financial. It was how he felt. He found himself talking to people more. Neighbors, shop owners, people he met during walks. Simple conversations that turned into familiar faces. Back home, he had grown used to brief interactions, quick greetings, short exchanges. But here, conversations lasted longer. People asked questions, shared stories, and slowly, he began feeling more connected. It wasn't something he expected. At 67, he thought making new connections would be difficult. But instead, it happened naturally. Days began blending into a routine that felt comfortable. Morning coffee, walks, simple meals, exploring new areas. And as weeks turned into months, something became clear. He wasn't just visiting anymore. He was building a new life. But even when things improve, challenges still follow. Living somewhere new always comes with adjustments. And even though the Philippines felt welcoming, it wasn't without challenges. Some things took getting used to. The heat, the slower pace, the occasional power interruptions, internet that wasn't always perfect. At first, these things felt frustrating, but slowly, he adjusted. He learned to plan around them, to be patient, to accept that life here moved differently. There were also moments of homesickness, missing familiar foods, missing familiar places, sometimes even missing the routine he once wanted to escape. But those feelings didn't last long, because every time he thought about going back, he compared how he felt now to how he felt before. And the difference was clear. Even with challenges, he felt better here. Less stressed, more relaxed, more present. And that realization became more important than the small inconveniences. Because life didn't have to be perfect. It just had to feel right. And slowly, he realized something else. He wasn't counting days anymore. He wasn't thinking about when he might leave. He was thinking about what came next. Because at 67, he hadn't just moved to a new place. He had found a new pace of life. And that changed everything. 2 years later, his life looked completely different. The routines that once felt unfamiliar now felt natural. The place that once felt distant now felt familiar. He had built a life that was simple, but meaningful. His mornings were slower. His days were flexible. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something. He was living in the moment. At 67, he thought retirement meant slowing down. But instead, it gave him a chance to start over. He wasn't trying to live luxuriously. He wasn't chasing something unrealistic. He had simply found a life that fit him better. A slower pace, lower stress, more time, more freedom. And perhaps the biggest change of all was how he viewed his future. Before, retirement felt like the final chapter. Now, it felt like something else entirely. A new beginning. Because sometimes, the biggest changes don't come from planning everything perfectly. Sometimes, they come from taking a chance, even later in life. Even when it feels uncertain. At 67, he thought his life was already written. But moving to the Philippines showed him something he never expected, that sometimes, even later in life, you can still change everything. And standing outside that small house, watching the sun set behind the mountains, he realized something simple. He didn't move to the Philippines to escape his old life. He moved to build a new one. And at 67, he discovered something many people never do. That retirement doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes, it's just the beginning.